I like this line about how to approach facts not in their crude facticity, but through the mediations by which facts acquire their immediacy. Facts appear immediate through a set of complex mediations: psychological, historical, ideological, economic. This question of whether something is fact or fiction is a reduction of the bookends on which we live our lives. We rarely live our lives simply on the edges of those bookends, where something is absolute, certain, historical, real, or something is in the pure realm of imaginary fantasy. Those bookends seem to me like a false choice to explore the complexity of contemporary life. My name is Walid Raad, and I want to thank you for being here. The first thing I need to say is that I've done a few of these presentations, but I still find that sometimes doing them makes me very nervous. Most of my work has been on the history of the wars in Lebanon. At the time, the militia that controlled the neighborhood where I lived, and I was not about to serve. So when they came for me, my dad gave me $800. I got a cargo boat to Cyprus, found my way to Paris, and landed in the United States. These are pictures I took a year before leaving Lebanon. I wanted to become a photojournalist. I wanted to basically shoot the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. And I used to go up to a parking lot across from my mother's house and stand with these men to photograph the assault on West Beirut. Now, I have no memory of having made these photos. Absolutely none. And I was very much troubled by this idea that one sometimes lives an experience but doesn't experience it. Is it possible that the events of the Lebanese wars of the past 40 years might have been lived but not experienced? And they've left hysterical, historical symptoms in culture that somebody needs to identify, collect, and archive. And if you couldn't find them, then you might as well produce them. And it's in that sense that the Atlas Group Archive came to be. The Atlas Group is presented as a think tank of sorts, investigating the possibilities but also the limits of the writing of the history of the wars of the past few decades. What you will see here is that the war is not reduced to a chronology of massacres or invasions. And it's certainly not reduced to the psychobiography of the participants. What you find are documents. You will see somebody engaged in a seemingly repetitive, quite exhaustive and endless task. In the psychological literature, they say that you're trying to recreate the anxiety whose omission was the very form of trauma. After every car bomb in Beirut, you'd open the newspaper and you'd read more about the make, model, and color of the car than about why it detonated. When a car explodes, one part remains intact. It's usually the engine. That engine, when the car explodes, it usually flies. And it would land on somebody's roof or balcony. During the wars, Lebanon was flooded with photojournalists who over time became quite bored with yet another car bomb. So they developed a game among themselves of who was going to find and photograph the engine first. I dug into the archive and I started finding pictures of engines, engine after engine. And sometimes it looks like the engine is treated as if it's a body part. It's being covered or it's bleeding. And you would have politicians who would come and pose next to the engine to prove they were doing everything in their power to catch those responsible. Because you know the engine has an engine number. The engine number leads you to the car's owner to the person responsible. It's as if it's the black box of some airplane crash. So this for me is very symptomatic of this idea of living an event but not experiencing it. You end up with this seemingly banal, neutral, harmless, bland object that comes to stand for the event. It's the form of the event. What generative encounters are made possible by events of extreme physical and psychological violence? These are not primarily and solely debilitating. They certainly are, but they're also quite generative of other experiences. You are in front of something very unusual, very difficult, very painful. And it's permitting a kind of experience I would not have otherwise. And it thus requires the creation of new concepts, forms, gestures. And an artist seemed to me to be the person who ends up deserving these events, that do justice to these events. The work is composed of the images as well as the story. They're in the realm of an artwork, an aesthetic fact. Enough to deserve an artwork. I mean, come on. Do we actually need another artist to actually show us that the cultural, financial, and military spheres are and have always been intimately linked? We do not need another artwork like this. This is uninteresting. As a kid, I collected bullets. This was not an unusual activity among my friends. You would buy them from militiamen, you would gift them, you would exchange them like one might exchange baseball cards. I was fascinated by the colors, the hues that adorn the bullets. Colors usually designate whether a bullet leaves a trace, or it explodes on impact, or it's incendiary. You would find these bullets in the walls, in buildings. What I used to do as a kid is I would run around, and wherever I found a bullet, I would photograph the site of my findings and place a dot corresponding to the color of the tip on my photographs. 20 years later, I actually discovered that every country that manufactures bullets has its own color code. The French have a color code, the Germans, the Americans, the Israelis, the Egyptians. I go back to look at my notebook, and in fact, it seemed as if every page was dedicated to a single country that had manufactured and sold bullets to a militia during the past civil wars. Now, in fact, this story is a fiction based on my real bullet collection. There's all kinds of facts. Historical facts, economic facts, sociological facts. Artwork is a place where one can engage multiple kinds of facts in their continuity and complexity. It's one of the few places. I would not expect this from journalism. I would not expect this from activism. But I would expect it from an artwork. Can you still hear me fine in the back? Yes? So, just 5 more minutes of historical facts, and then I promise we'll move on to other kinds of facts. So just stay with me for 3 more minutes, okay? My palette has always been photographic. This is the language, the techniques, the forms that I feel most comfortable in. This idea that you open a shutter, light filters through a lens, lands on a photosensitive surface. You expose that negative through an enlarger and it exposes a plate that you have to yet again put in developer. It's baffling that a technology that is predicated on receiving images that are upside down, black and white, highly grainy, would, in a matter of a short few decades, become equivalent to a neutral document of the real. At the same time that, of course, many artist photographers were constantly thrilled with the very mediated nature of photography itself. Those are, in a way, the bookends of my relationship with the photograph. Highly mediated technologies, set of forms, chemistry, liquids, and the seeming unmediated index of the real. And I've always gone back and forth between those two.